Hi everyone! So recently I was able to play early access of the full Diablo 4 game, and I know this is a video that a lot of you guys have been waiting for. I know a lot of you guys were theory crafting their builds, and there was like this damage bucket theory going around. This is this sheet here that people have been using to make their decisions. And when this was first released here by Snow Raven, it looked a little bit different actually, and there were a lot more damage categories, and people started making videos about this, and I kept getting 20,000 questions every single night about it. So let's talk about it. So with the early access, we actually had the opportunity to basically test everything that we wanted, because we actually had access to higher level items, we had access to all of these different damage mechanics, and we also just learned more about the game that made the testing easier. I want to give a shout out here for Northwar, one of my fellow Maxwell writers, who actually made like a full testing session and a write-up here for us. And it's actually pretty funny to read, but the findings are maybe not so funny for some of you guys. So I already knew that this sheet here was inaccurate at the very least. When I first saw this, I mentioned that, but I also didn't know exactly all the precise combinations of different damage buckets, as they were called. So people, for example, assumed that all the damage versus is one category of a combined multiplier, and then damage while healthy or damage while fortified would be a combined multiplier, and then you have like damage with. And it seems that by now this theory has actually evolved further, with people crunching the numbers and theory crafting more, and probably like looking at the data that they have collected. So one thing that is important to know is that initially, a lot of this testing was done with thorns, as far as I'm aware. So people try to use thorns because it always supposedly deals the same damage to an enemy. When they hit you, you have 20 thorns, they take 20 damage, multiplied by your damage multipliers. So while the damage may increase when you add a certain damage multiplier, there are certain other really wonky mechanics at play that make this kind of testing inaccurate. And you actually do have to do the manual labor of hitting a target dummy 1,000 times or so, and then trying it again with a different damage multiplier to see the difference. Now, this is exactly what we have done, especially Northwar, and he has actually confirmed basically all of these, or most of these mechanics, by manual testing. And then there are a few untested that are very similar to those that we did test, so that we can assume that they work similarly. So previously there were a lot more multiplier categories, which would have led to massively increased damage numbers in the late game with stacking of various multipliers. In general, it's always better to multiply damage instead of add more damage. So there is a mathematical difference in the calculation that produces either very large or kind of manageable numbers. When you have many multipliers, even if they're not really high, it can really get out of hand very fast. And it seems like the Diablo 4 team has actually done some steps to prevent this by, for example, creating this massive so-called additive damage category. This means you have only a few so-called damage buckets. Most importantly, there's going to be the main stats for each class. So every class has a certain stat that gives them % damage. And that is actually a multiplier. This is also confirmed in our testing. We have attack speed here, which, yeah, I guess technically gives you a multiplier if you forget about resource management and cooldowns. Then there's crit, and it seems like, yeah, all values of crit and crit damage just add up together from different sources. So it seems like this is accurate as well. Although there might be some exceptions with, for example, something like Burning Instinct or Gushing Wounds. So the Sorcerer legendary node and the Barbarian's key passive. So I'm not really sure if those would work with these conditional effects or just with the raw crit chance and the raw crit damage. This is something that remains to be tested. Then we have the vulnerable damage. We also confirmed that this is in fact a multiplier and that is nothing that scales with it. And most importantly, the exploit glyph gives you vulnerable damage. So you have a lot of vulnerable damage, which makes vulnerable basically mandatory for every single, respectable and late game build. So keep that in mind. And finally, this additive damage category. So basically anything that you can think of is in this category. Anything that is not either crit, main stat, or vulnerable goes in here. So all the stuff, damage to stun, damage to CC. So I gotta say to the authors of this sheet here, this is actually on point as far as I can tell. This is what I would, put my stamp of approval on. It does seem like this is actually the way that it works. Now, again, there might be bugs, there might be things we don't know. There might be, maybe one of these that randomly works a different way than anything else because of, a mistake in the code or whatever. So we don't know that because we didn't test every single one by hand, but we tested like, let's say, half of them or something like that. And it seems like they were all always working the same way. What this also means is that you can't do any crazy shenanigans with, for example, damage while healthy. I know that some people are trying to theory craft around this because this was supposedly a multiplier. And, well, it is not. In fact, everything that you can find on Paragon boards is generally just additive damage. It's just core skill damage or, damage to stunned enemies or something like that. And potion healing for whatever reason. Potion healing seems to be very valuable for the developers. Outside of that, there are still the legendary Paragon nodes, there are legendary aspects, and all these things. I guess this is supposed to be this here, the X% damage category. So all of these are usually multipliers. You have, aspect of inner calm, aspect of the expectant. You have these legendary Paragon nodes. So generally they have an X in front of their number, and this means that they are multiplicative. It also means that when you are actually playing the game, you should try to kind of steer clear of those conditional damage modifiers. So what I mean is, for example, damage to stunned enemies. You cannot always stun enemies because they might get unstoppable, or against the boss, you cannot stun them at all unless you stagger them. So generally, these numbers are relatively similar to more unconditional effects. For example, damage with core skills, or damage versus close enemies. This always works as long as you are close, as a melee build, for example. So it's generally better to have these kind of stats on your items and pick up these stats from your paragons than these more conditional effects that might not always apply. I think this is a pretty major balancing issue, but this is how it works. On the other hand, you do have so much additive damage in the late game. We're probably going to look at almost 4-digit numbers or something like, 1000% or 800% or something like that. Additive damage is probably not going to be, something rare. So that, a bit of a minor difference of certain stats applying under certain circumstances doesn't do all that much. But for the really big chunks that add a lot of this conditional damage, for example, the control glyph on the rogue then can give you something like 200% damage to crowd controlled enemies, that can be a pretty sizable damage loss when you are fighting, let's say, a boss, and you don't have this. Even if you have, let's say, 1000% additive damage or something, you lose 200%. It doesn't sound like too much, but on the other hand, your DPS goes down like by almost a fifth. So this is definitely something to consider. Whenever you make a build, you should probably try to include the more unconditional effects as much as possible, because they actually all count the same. And that's it for this video. So as I can confirm now, finally after the embargo, this sheet as it is looks accurate to me, and maybe we're gonna find something else, but for now this is what I would go with for the theory crafting. If you also read up North Wars right up here, I have that linked in the description as well. So feel free to check that out. Hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you guys next time.